And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this intense front pushing storm force winds with gusts at 80 miles per hour into the western Aleutians and also across the entire western Bering Sea here. But to the east, high pressure, light winds, dry eastern Aleutians, actually the eastern half of the Bering Sea here, right into the interior. And a weak system up here bringing areas of light snow from Norton Sound all the way up across the western Brooks Range, Arctic coast areas. And drying out over the panhandle as this high begins to take over the weather pattern there as that low kicks off to the east and southeast. Then for tomorrow, high pressure slips into the Yukon, but still extending all the way out into the southeast Bering Sea here in Bristol Bay. A couple of weak disturbances to the north with some snow shower activity there. Otherwise, light winds, mostly clear skies, and that'll extend somewhat into the central interior as well. And then the panhandle much drier tomorrow with maybe some clearing in some areas. This front starting to weaken slowly with gale force winds coming into the Aleutians there, or the Adak-Atka area, maybe a little stronger, and again starting to bear down on the Pribilof Islands. And we'll see that front really weakens by Monday afternoon here, with diminishing winds and a narrowing band of precipitation. Otherwise, dry, high pressure holds here over the interior with a lot of clear skies into the Yukon. Big storm comes into the northeast Pacific, and the pressure difference between the cold high and the much milder low there really puts a squeeze on the atmosphere, looking for very strong winds, snow, blowing snow. Winter storm watches out for a good portion of the panhandle. High wind warnings out for the southern southeast coast for gusts above 60 miles per hour. And for tomorrow, northwest winds there for the south coast of the panhandle at 25 knots. North to northwest, 15 to 20 knots. On the central coast, north coast, east-northeast at 25. North, 30 knots. Lynn Canal, sea 6 feet. And for Stevens Passage, north at 20 knots. And northwest 20 knots for Clarence Strait with a 7-foot sea height. Big increase in the winds here for the south coast on Monday, east to southeast, 45 knots, gusts to 60 knots. Central coast east-northeast at 45 knots, 18 to 22 foot seas there. And the north coast northeast winds 20 to 40 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, all north at 40 knots, seas 7 to 11 feet, and for Clarence Strait, southeast winds of 40 knots with 12-foot seas. Prince William Sound tomorrow, north winds at 20 knots. Otherwise, the North Gulf Coast looking at north winds about 25 to 35 knots. Small craft advisories here for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, northwest winds at 25 knots. Cook Inlet, variable winds, 10 to 15 knots. And then for Monday, northern Cook Inlet, northeast winds of 15 knots with 4-foot seas. Same forecast for Prince William Sound as well. Southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, north winds 35 knots, a little stronger there for the Barren Islands, north at 40 knots. And small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, north to northeasterlies, 25 knots. Prince William Sound, northeast wind 15 knots. Kodiak Island, north winds for Sunday at 20 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, east northeast to maybe north and variable, but pretty light, 10 to 15 knots in those areas. North at 15 for Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay on Monday, northeast, 15 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds, 15 to 25 knots. And Kodiak Island, north winds, 30 to 35 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow. Here, we've got southeast winds on the increase coming up to gale force here toward Nikolsky, up to 45 knots in the afternoon. Otherwise, we have storm warnings here for Adak and Atka, south to southeast, 50 knots, and storm warnings for the western Aleutians as well, south to southeast winds, 50 to 60 knots. And for Monday, southwest, 40 to 45 knots for areas west of Adak, central Aleutians here, Adak and Atka. South to southwest, 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Fox Islands. South to southeast winds, 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, south to southwest winds, 15 to 20 tomorrow. St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, southwest 20 to 25. Storm warnings for St. Matthew Island. South winds, 50 knots. Seas, 16 feet. Pribilof's gale warnings, south 35 knots, 9-foot seas. And for the Bering Sea here, St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, St. George, all looking at southeast winds of 45 knots with seas anywhere from 20 to 27 feet. Southwest coast, southeast winds 30 knots, 5 to 7 foot seas. St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 30. Norton Sound, southeast 25. And light west winds for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow at 15 knots, and for the western Arctic coast, south to southeast only at 10 knots. Southeast at 15 for the central coast, and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots. And then for the day on Monday, we've got west-southwest breeze here for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast at 15 knots, southeast at 20 knots for the central and western Arctic coast, and then gale warnings here for the Chukchi Sea for southeast winds 30 to 35 knots.